one of the most lauded and revolutionary minds in the field of evolutionary studies, the head of several research programs in Boston and Washington, a theorist whose every remark was scrutinized by his peers for clues to his next breakthrough. But his genius had been flawed by addiction. Mescaline and its derivatives had brought him low, much to the satisfaction of men.
Oh boy. Alright guys, this week we are looking at Clive Barker's The Great and Secret Show, and we're asking ourselves the question, can we hate a book that we once really liked? Or possibly also ask the question, can an audiobook ruin a book that we once really liked? In this case, it might be a little bit of both. So if you're not familiar with Clive Barker, he came to prominence in the 80s as a horror author, and primarily through short fiction via his Books of Blood series, The Hellbound Heart, which got adapted into the movie Hellraiser, which is one of the biggest horror icons of all time. So I'm not really sure what prompted me to pick up The Great and Secret Show, but it sounded a little bit different. I like fantasy, but I like weird, kind of more magical realism kind of fantasy stuff. I'm much more of a Neil Gaiman fan than, let's say, a Robert Jordan reader. Not that Robert Jordan isn't fantastic, it's just not the flavor of, I guess, speculative fiction that I prefer to read. I really like things that have a slightly darker tone, and I like things that kind of overlap more of a mythological sense to the fantastic rather than like an incredibly or a completely separate second world that we're kind of playing in with hard magic systems. The Great and Secret Show kind of seemed to fall into this category, so I picked it up and oh boy. So it had been a long time since I had read this book, and last year I read The Stand, right before the whole 2020 everything. When I read about Randall Flagg in The Stand, it kind of reminded me of Randolph Jaffe in The Great and Secret Show. Not just because of the names, but because of what the character embodied. If you've read The Stand, you know what I'm talking about. If you watch the most recent TV series adaptation that Amazon Prime did of The Stand, I'm not really sure that what they were thinking of in terms of casting, but for me, it was way off the mark for most of the characters, but that's besides the point. I'm also in the process of working on some creative projects that kind of try to capture that same sort of essence that I thought was in The Great and Secret Show, so I wanted to come back and revisit it. Unfortunately, I had given my copy to my brother, and at first, I jokingly thought that my brother would think less of me because the content is a little bit out there, but now I think he might think less of me because maybe the book isn't so good. So what's The Great and Secret Show all about? Basically, we follow, the book kicks off, we follow the character Randolph Jaffe, who works in a post office in the middle of America, and it's kind of like the middle of the road place where all mail gets stops off from one side of the country to the other. He somehow stumbles across this letter that talks about something called the art and some secret cabal underpinning the inner workings of America and reality behind the reality that we know. And he kind of starts becoming obsessed with it. This leads him to commit a murder almost on the spot and go in pursuit of this thing that he started reading about. In this pursuit, he ends up crossing this barrier into something called the metacosm. So according to the mythology in The Great and Secret Show, we live in something called the cosm, and the metacosm is kind of the world behind the world that contains all these extra aspects to reality and where we get a lot of terms thrown at us that aren't quite explained. There's a character there who reveals a little bit more to him and then kind of sets him off on this journey of being able to cross this barrier and access the dream sea, which is known as quiddity, and become, you know, this absolute wielder of the art, which is basically just a vague notion of what they refer to as magic. In his process, he stumbles upon some crazy mad mescaline fueled scientist named Fletcher and gets him to create some serum known as the Nuncio. The titles of the things in this book they're not the greatest. You take the Nuncio and it hyper realizes your powers, and then Fletcher sees what he created, he decides to take it for himself, and then you have this good versus evil, much like in The Stand. It's a very cut and dry good versus evil type of story. The Great and Secret Show has far less character development, and I'll get to that in a second. Once you've established these, you know, the ultimate good in Fletcher and the ultimate bad in Jaffe, What ends up happening is they battle each other for access to the metacosm, because Fletcher doesn't think that Jaff could or should get it because he's evil, and Jaff thinks that Fletcher doesn't know what he's talking about. Their conflict takes them across America until, exhausted, they lay dormant beneath some water reservoir in California in a place called Palomo Grove. This is where it sections off into the next part of the book, and this book kind of comes at you in parts, and each part is quite disjointed from the part previous, so you end up kind of crossing a lot of time. If that's jarring for a reader, this is going to be a difficult book to come to terms with. After they're dormant underneath here, we follow basically the inhabitants of Palomo Grove, primarily a group of young girls who go swimming in the lake, and so exhausted that they can't fight each other anymore. Somehow, I don't even know if they make contact with the girls, Fletcher and Jaff end up impregnating two of the women, and those women end up having their sons. Once again, we flash forward until, or not just sons, sorry, their children, their sons and daughters. And then once again, the next section, we end up flashing forward until they're all grown up. The offspring of Jaff and Fletcher are grown up, and then Jaff and Fletcher kind of come back into the fold and into the plot a little bit. One of them only long enough to pass his power or intellect or insight onto yet another set of characters that get introduced kind of halfway through. Again, this is kind of a passing of the baton of characters, and if something like George R. R. Martin bothers you, where like you'll fall in love with a character right before they die, this will bother you even more because you don't quite fall in love with any of the characters, because there's not a lot of character to fall in love with. When it comes to the characters of The Great Secret Show, I think that's the hardest part of the book for me. It's not that it's gratuitous, it's not that it has that content in it, it's not even necessarily the disjointed jumping around of the plot. It's kind of that these characters pop in and out, and they kind of just assume a very, I don't want to say they're cardboard cutout, but if somebody were to make that claim, I wouldn't disagree with them. They're kind of set pieces to kind of tell the mythology of the story. And the point of the book is kind of to scoop you up in this mythology and kind of give you this very world behind a world feeling while you're reading it. And then the whole conflict essentially revolves around preserving quiddity, which is the dream sea that people visit at 3 points in their lives. They visit it when they're born, they visit it right before they die, and they visit it when in the meeting of their first love or something like that. And again, everything about quiddity exists in this metacosm. In the dream sea, you have an archipelago of islands called the Ephemeris that isn't really explained, and you have these creatures called the Iad or Ouroboros who live on the other side, who want to come and claim the cosm as well by crossing over that barrier, and I guess taking over our side of reality. So this was intended to be a trilogy, so I think the whole point of the first one is essentially setup, and a lot of trilogies do that. The first book is almost entirely set up, and then you kind of get more and more of the world in the second and third books. The problem is that I think he wrote the second book like 3 years later, and then the third book still isn't out, and it's like, you know, we're more than 20 years waiting for the third one. Now, I'll be honest, I tried to pick up the second one, Everville, and when I started to read it, it just didn't capture me the same way, and I read it a couple years after I read the first one. And even if you wanted to get into this book and check it out, and Clive Barker interested you at all, I definitely would advise against going with the audiobook. So granted, I listen to audiobooks at 1.5 times speed, sometimes a little bit less. It depends on how fast the narrator is speaking. But this guy really sounded like an old-timey, like 1950s sportscaster as he was reading it. And I couldn't think of somebody who fit the stylistic voice of Clive Barker less than who they chose as a narrator. And I hate to say that because I don't want to be disparaging towards any creative, but at the same time, like, maybe if this guy read nonfiction, he would be fine, but...
His recent fall from grace, one of the most lauded and revolutionary minds in the field of evolutionary studies, the head of several research programs in Boston and Washington, a theorist whose every remark was scrutinized by his peers for clues to his next breakthrough. But his genius had been flawed by addiction. Mescaline and its derivatives had brought him low, much to the satisfaction of
mescaline. Yeah, the narrator did not fit this at all. I think what the Great and Secret Show accomplishes is an attempt to bring us into this very strange, dark, mythological, reality, sub-reality, while at the same time kind of sweeping us up in this Hollywood-esque type I guess almost like sexual cabal. Like there's a lot of sexual content in this, a lot of dark imagery in this. Those two things cross paths. There's a lot of disgusting kind of manifestations in this. If you have read the book and you remember what the licks are, the way those are created, don't have your kids read this book. Maybe even adults shouldn't read this book. If you're easily offended or you're easily grossed out, not the book for you. If you're looking for something titillating, maybe this might be it. But again, a little bit rough. I think one of the things that I said earlier on really hits home, and that's the fact that I reread this because when I read The Stand, I thought it reminded me of The Great and Secret Show. But one of the things that Stephen King is lauded for, and one of the things he talks about when he talks about writing, is the fact that he is so character obsessed. He basically just writes about the characters until the plot comes through. He's been criticized for sometimes going on overly long tangents, and he's totally okay with doing this for the sake of exploring the characters in his book. Whether, certain critics might like the way he does that or not, it's something that is really at the focus. And when you read The Stand, it's a slow burn at the start because we get time with those characters, and I feel like that time is important, and I think that's what really allowed me to invest myself in The Stand and enjoy it. Whereas The Great and Secret Show is just weird, and it was weird, and I think I was looking for weird at the time when I first read it, but in terms of its own merits to carry a book for the 600 or 700 pages that this is, I found it really difficult, and I found it a slog as an audiobook. So I got to be honest, I'm a little disappointed. This isn't a book I ever really recommended to people because, again, just due to the content, I don't want people to have maybe I didn't want to have people to have a certain opinion about me because it was a book that I enjoyed reading. But on second reading, didn't quite hit the mark. And that's a bummer because, sometimes you stumble into a book the first time and it really, really blows you away, and you find that, it's interesting in a way that you've never seen before. And then upon rereading, you realize, maybe that was a misjudgment. So this is actually one of the reasons why I don't reread books too often, because I'm scared of looking at books that I once loved and seeing them for something that they weren't. So if you have a book that you have read in the past and reread and it didn't quite hit you the way you thought it did, or maybe you were in a different place in your life when you read it the first time as you are now and it didn't hit the same, please let me know, because I feel like that's an interesting thing. I think we evolve as readers, particularly because I didn't even start reading a lot until I was older than most readers when they start. That could have been a big factor in terms of why I might have liked this in the beginning, just exposure to new things. Other than that, guys, if you read this one, let me know what you think, and I'll catch you guys on the next review. Os.